In the quiet suburbs of Gresham, Oregon, the night of June 9, 2016 began like any other. A cool breeze brushed through the empty streets, and the distant hum of traffic was the only sound cutting through the darkness. Inside a ground-floor apartment complex on Northeast 188th Avenue, a single light flickered behind drawn curtains. It was the home of a woman who had fought hard to rebuild her life. A mother, a worker, and a survivor of the bitter divorce. Her name was Anastasia Hester, though everyone called her Annie. Before dawn, she would be gone. It started with faint noises that went unnoticed by most of her neighbors. A dull thud, the scraping sound of something metallic. Then, silence. At around 3 in the morning, a terrified voice reached the emergency dispatcher. It was Annie. Her words were fragmented, drenched in panic. She had been attacked inside her apartment. The dispatcher tried to keep her on the line, guiding her voice through fear and blood loss, but the line cut out before help could arrive. When paramedics entered the small apartment minutes later, the scene was unlike anything they had expected. Annie was barely alive. She had been stabbed dozens of times, over 60 wounds to her face, neck, chest, and arms. Her strength had carried her long enough to make that desperate call for help, but not long enough to survive. She was pronounced dead shortly after reaching the hospital. Her murder would send shockwaves through the small Oregon community, not only for its brutality, but for the tangled web of betrayal, jealousy, and custody disputes that lay beneath it. The apartment was a picture of chaos. Blood spattered across walls and furniture. A kitchen knife lay near the entrance. 2 more knives were found on the carpet, all believed to have come from her own kitchen. The attacker had not broken the door or forced a lock. Instead, investigators found something unusual. The window air conditioning unit had been removed from the frame, leaving just enough space for someone to crawl inside. Outside, a cinder block bore faint blood smears and shoe impressions. Whoever came that night knew how to get in quietly. The violence was personal. Each strike showed anger, not panic. The wounds weren't random. They were targeted, deliberate. Investigators later described the scene as one of the most vicious acts of rage they had ever encountered. But what was most chilling wasn't just how she was killed. It was what it revealed about who might have wanted her dead. Anastasia Astor was 34 years old. She was known by friends and coworkers as creative, hardworking, and devoted to her daughter, Alice. She juggled multiple jobs, working as a supervisor at a local call center during the day and part-time at a school program in the evenings. She was the kind of person who made friends easily, who stayed positive even when life kept throwing challenges her way. But behind the smiles and the small talk, her life had been unraveling for months. She was recently divorced from her husband, Matthew Hester. Their relationship had deteriorated into hostility, fueled by financial troubles, accusations, and a bitter custody battle over their young daughter. The court had ruled in Annie's favor. She had been granted full custody, and Matthew was ordered to pay support. It was a decision that angered him, one that friends say he never accepted. To make matters worse, Matthew had remarried quickly after the divorce. His new wife, Angela McCraw Hester, had become entangled in the tension between the former couple. Friends of Annie's later recalled that she felt watched, that she feared her ex-husband's resentment could spill into something worse. In the weeks before her death, Annie told coworkers she had a bad feeling, that someone had been outside her window one night. She brushed it off at first, convincing herself she was just being paranoid, but the fear never left. When she came home late from work, she would double-check the locks, close the blinds, and make sure her daughter was safe in her grandmother's care. On June 9th, those precautions weren't enough. Detectives soon realized that Annie's death was no random attack. The intruder came directly for her. There was no sign of theft, no sign of sexual assault, and no attempt to hide the body. Whoever killed her wanted it to be brutal, personal, final. The medical examiner's report would later reveal over 60 stab wounds consistent with a prolonged struggle. Defensive wounds covered Annie's hands and forearms, showing she fought for her life. Her body told the story, her voice could not. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a calculated murder, driven by emotion. The discovery stunned the community. Neighbors who had spoken to her days earlier now watched as police cordoned off the area, forensic teams swarming in and out. They collected fingerprints, photographed every drop of blood, and searched for anything that could identify the killer. Officers canvassed nearby businesses for security footage, hoping to spot any suspicious vehicles during the hours before the murder. But the leads were thin, and the crime scene seemed to offer more questions than answers. Detectives learned that Annie's ex-husband lived across the Columbia River in Vancouver, Washington with his new wife. On the night of the murder, they claimed to have been at home asleep, but within days, inconsistencies began to surface. Matthew's phone data didn't align with his statements. Angela's timeline had unexplained gaps. And there were whispers among Annie's friends that she had been receiving strange messages before her death. Messages, she believed, came from someone close to Matthew. The investigation would take months, crossing state lines and requiring hundreds of hours of surveillance review. But yet from the very first night, detectives felt something in their instincts. This wasn't random. It was targeted, and it had roots deep in the bitterness of Annie's personal life. Even before any arrest, they began piecing together a theory. Someone familiar with Annie's apartment layout, someone who knew her schedule, someone who wanted her to suffer. When the evidence would finally point to her killers, it would confirm what they had suspected all along. This was a crime born not of opportunity, but of obsession. But in those first few hours after her death, the focus was simply survival. Officers traced her final 911 call. Her voice was faint, fading, the recording almost inaudible. "Help me," she whispered. Then a thud, and silence. The phone line went dead. It was the last moment anyone heard Annie alive. The detectives stood inside that blood-soaked apartment, knowing that what they saw would stay with them forever. They didn't know then that it would take more than a year to find the person responsible. They didn't know that the motive would be jealousy, custody, and control, all hidden behind a marriage that was supposed to have moved on. All they knew was that a young mother had been brutally murdered, and the truth was buried beneath layers of lies. That night, crime scene technicians photographed the boot prints near the window, lifted samples of blood, and collected the 3 kitchen knives as evidence. The knives were later analyzed for fingerprints and DNA. The blood on the carpet wasn't all Annie's. There were traces that didn't belong to her. It was small, a drop, a smear, but it was enough. Forensic testing would later identify that trace as belonging to another woman. It was the first silent clue that this murder wasn't the work of a stranger. It was the work of someone Annie knew. In the days that followed, detectives knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, and pieced together Annie's final hours. Some recalled seeing a dark vehicle parked near the complex around midnight. Others heard faint footsteps and muffled sounds, but dismissed them as late-night noise. No one imagined it was a murder unfolding behind those walls. The case file began to grow thicker, filled with photographs, phone logs, and witness statements. Each page brought detectives closer to what they feared, the possibility that this killing was orchestrated not by a stranger in the dark, but by those who had once been part of Annie's life. As the sun rose over Gresham the next morning, her apartment was sealed off, the blinds still drawn, and the light inside would forever be gone. The brutality of the crime would haunt the city for years. It wasn't only the loss of a mother or a friend. It was the reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't strangers at all. They're the ones who once called you family. And for detectives, one question echoed through every piece of evidence they collected. Who could hate Anastasia Hester enough to kill her this way?
Before the blood, before the call, before the breaking news that would rattle the quiet neighborhoods of Gresham, there was simply Annie, a woman who had already survived heartbreak once and was trying to begin again. To understand her death, you must first understand her life, because every piece of her story leads to the motive that eventually took it from her. Anastasia Hester was born and raised in Oregon, known for her sharp humor, her creativity, and her deep devotion to her daughter. She was the kind of person who made ordinary things beautiful, painting faces at community fairs, sewing costumes for her little girl, and helping neighbors whenever she could. She was gentle, but not weak. Those close to her described her as determined, independent, and fiercely protective of her child. After years in an unhappy marriage, she had finally begun to find her footing again. Her marriage to Matthew Hester had started like any other, a small ceremony, hopes for a quiet life, dreams of raising a family. But behind the smiles, their relationship began to fracture. Money was tight, and arguments about finances soon became arguments about everything else. Friends noticed the change in Annie. She became quieter, more withdrawn. When the marriage finally collapsed, it wasn't peaceful. The divorce was ugly, public, and drawn out, with one question dominating every hearing: who would get custody of their daughter, Alice? In 2016, just weeks before the murder, the court granted Annie full custody. Matthew was ordered to pay support, a decision that angered him deeply. People close to the couple said he had always wanted control over finances, over decisions, over the narrative of their life. The ruling took that away from him. It was a legal loss, but to Matthew, it felt like personal humiliation. And his new wife, Angela McCraw Hester, shared in that bitterness. Angela had come into Matthew's life not long after the separation. She was known as quiet, reserved, sometimes guarded, but those who met her said she carried a simmering resentment toward Annie. She believed Annie had ruined Matthew's life, that she had manipulated the court system to win custody and money. Angela's jealousy wasn't subtle. It leaked into her words, her online posts, even casual conversations. In her eyes, Annie wasn't just an ex-wife. She was an obstacle that had to be erased from Matthew's world completely. Annie, on the other hand, was focused on building stability. She worked long hours at her job in Portland, managed her bills carefully, and looked forward to a future where she and Alice could start fresh. Her co-workers later told detectives that Annie often joked about how tired she was, but also how relieved she felt to have her life finally back. She had no idea that the resentment growing in her ex-husband's new home would soon turn deadly. Those final weeks of Annie's life were filled with small warnings that didn't make sense until later. She told a friend that she thought someone had been watching her apartment. Once, she came home to find her window screen slightly bent, though nothing inside seemed disturbed. Another time, she thought she saw a vehicle parked too long near her building. She mentioned it to her family, but there wasn't much they could do. Annie believed in moving forward, not living in fear. The truth is, she was being watched. Detectives would later discover that Matthew and Angela had been tracking Annie's movements, using social media, shared custody schedules, and even direct surveillance to monitor her life. They knew when she worked, when she was home, and most importantly, when her daughter wasn't there. The night Annie was murdered, her child was staying safely with her grandmother, a detail the killer was almost certainly aware of. At the core of this tragedy was a toxic blend of jealousy and control. Matthew could not accept losing his family, and Angela could not accept sharing him with the shadow of another woman. Investigators believed that together they allowed that resentment to fester until it evolved into something darker, a decision to end Annie's life. Friends of Annie remembered that she tried to remain cordial for the sake of her daughter, though communication with Matthew was strained. Every text exchange was documented, every email monitored, because she feared conflict. The custody ruling had made her legally secure, but emotionally she still lived under the pressure of their hostility. She often told people she just wanted peace, to raise her daughter without constant tension. That peace never came. When news of her death spread through the community, the grief was immediate. Vigils were held outside her apartment building. Her co-workers from the after-school program spoke about her kindness and patience with children. They described her as a person who never complained, who carried her struggles quietly. One of them recalled how Annie once said she wanted to build something better for her daughter, to show her that life could start over. That dream was stolen in a single night. The investigation, meanwhile, grew rapidly. Detectives worked tirelessly, driven not only by duty, but by outrage. The sheer violence of the attack told them the killer had been fueled by emotion. This wasn't a stranger wandering through the neighborhood. It was someone with a deep connection to the victim. Within days, suspicion began to point toward the people closest to Annie's former life. They learned that in the months before the murder, Matthew and Angela had made multiple trips across state lines, from their home in Vancouver, Washington, into Oregon. There were receipts, cell tower pings, and camera sightings that showed them traveling near Gresham at unusual hours. When questioned, they gave rehearsed answers. Their stories were consistent, too consistent. Detectives knew they were hiding something, but they needed hard evidence. Forensic teams combed through the apartment again and again, analyzing every hair, every print, every drop of blood. The evidence they would later find, traces of DNA not belonging to Annie, would become the thread that unraveled the case. But at this point in the investigation, all they had were patterns, motives, and intuition. Behind the scenes, Annie's family struggled to understand the horror that had taken them from her. Her mother stepped in to care for Alice, shielding her from the chaos that followed. Reporters crowded the streets. Headlines called it one of Oregon's most violent domestic murders in recent memory. But in those early weeks, there were no arrests, no confessions, and no closure. Investigators continued digging into Matthew and Angela's backgrounds. They discovered that Angela had purchased a specific type of boot months before the killing, which would later match the bloody footprint left on Annie's floor. They learned that Matthew had contacted an insurance agent about a life insurance policy tied to Annie shortly after her death. It was a move that raised eyebrows among detectives and reinforced their suspicions. Still, at that stage, suspicion wasn't enough. They needed physical proof. Meanwhile, Angela's behavior after the murder caught attention. While others mourned, she appeared detached, almost indifferent. She claimed she had been sick that night, awake with stomach pain, while Matthew slept. Yet her phone records showed activity around the same time as the killing. And there was a gap, nearly 2 hours, where her whereabouts couldn't be accounted for. Those 2 hours would become critical later on. For now, all investigators could do was wait and watch. They began following Matthew and Angela, collecting more surveillance, interviewing family members, and mapping out the timeline leading up to Annie's death. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear. This was not spontaneous violence. It was premeditated. Annie's life, once filled with ordinary dreams, had ended because someone decided she shouldn't have it anymore. Someone who saw her happiness not as recovery, but as defiance. Every document in the custody case, every social media post, every word exchanged between her and Matthew had become fuel for resentment. Detectives would later say that Annie's story represented a familiar but devastating pattern. Domestic control evolving into fatal obsession. It was a reminder that leaving doesn't always end the danger. Sometimes it triggers it. In her final weeks, Annie had done everything right. She had followed the law, trusted the system, and fought for her daughter. And still, the danger found her. The second chapter of her story, the hunt for the killer, was about to begin. Within a year, forensic science would expose the truth. Surveillance footage would place a vehicle exactly where it shouldn't have been, and a drop of blood too small to notice would reveal the identity of the intruder. But before that breakthrough, investigators had to face the hardest reality in any murder case. When the killer is someone the victim once loved, justice moves slowly. The woman who had spent her life trying to protect her child had been destroyed by a web of jealousy and vengeance by those who once claimed to love her. Annie's story was no longer just a tragedy, it was a puzzle, and detectives were determined to solve it, no matter how long it took.
The night of June 9, 2016, unfolded in silence across the small city of Gresham. The air was still, apartment lights dimmed one by one as people went to bed, unaware that inside one ground-floor unit, a nightmare was already taking form. Anastasia Annie Hester's last night on Earth began quietly. Her workday had been long. She made dinner, sent a few messages to friends, and watched something on her laptop before turning in. Her daughter was safe with her grandmother, giving Annie a rare night alone, a night that should have been peaceful. But in another home across the Columbia River, plans were already being set in motion. Detectives later reconstructed the timeline with chilling precision. Around 10:45 p.m., a dark-colored vehicle, later identified as belonging to Matthew and Angela Hester, was spotted by a security camera near a gas station a mile or two from Annie's apartment. It was the same car seen earlier that day near the couple's home in Vancouver. At 11 p.m., another surveillance camera captured the vehicle crossing into Oregon. The license plate was partially obscured, but the make and model matched perfectly. At 11:27 p.m., a neighbor living 2 floors above Annie's apartment heard faint noises, what she described as metal scraping followed by a thud. She thought it was someone adjusting their air conditioner. What she didn't know was that the killer was removing Annie's window unit piece by piece, creating an opening large enough to slip through. Inside, Annie may have been asleep or just getting ready for bed when she heard the noise. The intruder crawled in quietly, stepping onto the carpet. The crime scene later showed that the first confrontation likely happened in the hallway, where blood spatter indicated Annie tried to run. She fought desperately, using her hands to block the blows. The medical examiner later found deep defensive wounds, proof she had tried to survive. The attacker used multiple knives from Annie's own kitchen. Forensic reports confirmed that 3 knives had been removed from a block on the counter. 2 broke during the assault. A third was left near the entryway. There was no sign of hesitation, no moment of mercy, just relentless, repeated strikes, more than 60 in total. Annie's 911 call came in at 3:02 a.m. Her voice was faint, broken. She said only a few words. "Help, I've been stabbed." Dispatchers traced the call but could get no response after 20 seconds. When police arrived, the apartment door was unlocked. Blood trails led from the hallway to the kitchen and then to the living room where Annie collapsed. She was still alive when paramedics reached her, but she had lost too much blood. She was taken to a nearby hospital and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The brutality was staggering. Investigators immediately ruled out burglary. Nothing was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry at the door. The only way in was through the window. It was deliberate, careful, and personal. At dawn, Gresham police sealed off the complex. Detectives worked through the day, combing every inch of the apartment for evidence. They collected 3 knives, several bloody footprints, and samples of blood from multiple surfaces. The prints near the window were distinct, a specific tread pattern that matched a women's boot size 9. One of those prints contained a trace of blood later identified as belonging to someone else than Annie. It was the first clue that the killer had been injured during the attack. Meanwhile, detectives started their first round of interviews. Neighbors spoke of hearing muffled cries, but thought they were part of a movie playing on at TV. A few had seen a dark SUV near the building earlier in the night. No one saw anyone enter or leave. That absence of witnesses made the case more chilling. Someone had slipped in and out of a small apartment complex, committed a savage murder, and vanished without a trace. For days, investigators worked tirelessly. They checked nearby gas stations, banks, and traffic cameras. Then came the first break. A security video from a business less than a mile away captured a vehicle passing at 3:25 a.m., minutes after the 911 call. The taillight configuration matched Matthew Hester's SUV. Investigators ran the plate, and what they found only deepened their suspicion. The car was registered to Angela McCraw Hester. She and her husband Matthew claimed to have been home all night, but when detectives compared their phone records, something didn't add up. Both their phones were inactive for several hours that coincided with the window of the murder, from about 11 p.m. to 3:30 a.m. It looked deliberate, as if they had turned them off to avoid being tracked. When police visited their home, they noticed small scratches on Angela's hand. She said she had cut herself while cooking, but she couldn't recall what meal she had been preparing. The story didn't sit right. Detectives took note and quietly began surveillance on the couple. Weeks passed, then months. The blood sample found in Annie's apartment was sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. When the results came back, they confirmed what investigators feared. It didn't belong to Annie. It belonged to another female. When they compared the sample against Angela's DNA, it was a match. That single discovery changed everything. It tied Angela directly to the crime scene. Detectives began building a timeline that showed how the murder was planned. Angela had purchased a pair of black women's boots months before the killing, the exact model that matched the bloody footprint near the window. Receipts confirmed the purchase. Further investigation revealed that she and Matthew had driven from Washington into Oregon that night, likely parking near the apartment complex. Angela, smaller and quieter, may have been the one to enter through the window while Matthew waited nearby. Prosecutors later theorized that Matthew orchestrated the attack, providing information about Annie's schedule and location, while Angela carried it out. It was an act of loyalty twisted into violence. Detectives confronted the couple with the evidence. Both denied involvement. Angela maintained she was home, claiming she had been sick with food poisoning, but when investigators showed her the surveillance stills of her car near Gresham that night, she had no explanation. Shortly after, she and Matthew stopped cooperating altogether. With DNA, surveillance, and motive aligned, detectives obtained a warrant for Angela's arrest.
On October 17, 2017, over a year after Annie's death, police tracked Angela to Pocatello, Idaho, where she had moved to be close to relatives. She was arrested and extradited to Oregon to face charges of second-degree murder. Matthew, who had continued living in Washington, was initially questioned but not charged. Angela's arrest made headlines across the Pacific Northwest. The case was described as one of the most calculated acts of domestic violence in Oregon's recent history. For investigators, it was bittersweet. They had found Annie's killer, but the man believed to have masterminded the plot was still free. As the case prepared for trial, prosecutors uncovered even more disturbing details. Forensic technicians re-examined Annie's apartment and found partial prints on the kitchen knife block, fingerprints belonging to Angela. They also found microscopic fibers on Annie's clothing that matched a blanket from the Hester home in Vancouver. The evidence of premeditation was undeniable. Behind the scenes, prosecutors began looking into Matthew's role. They discovered that just days after Annie's death, he had inquired about a life insurance policy and attempted to claim custody of her daughter through a new petition, arguing that Annie was unfit before her death. The timing was suspicious. It painted a picture of a man prepared for an outcome he claimed he knew nothing about. The investigation became one of patience and precision. Detectives wanted airtight proof, not just of Angela's guilt, but of Matthew's involvement. They reconstructed the couple's phone activity, vehicle movements, and financial records. The deeper they dug, the clearer the story became. The murder was a conspiracy rooted in custody, jealousy, and revenge. But even with overwhelming evidence, justice would take time. Angela's trial was postponed multiple times, stretching into years. Matthew remained under scrutiny, his calm demeanor in interviews masking a growing unease. For investigators, every delay was agony. They had promised Annie's family answers, and they intended to deliver them. The night that began in silence had ended with screams that echoed far beyond those apartment walls. Annie's murder revealed the darkest side of human emotion, the moment when love turns to hatred and reason gives way to obsession. Detectives had their suspect, but the full story of how it all came together and how Matthew's role would eventually be exposed was still waiting to unfold.
By late 2017, the walls around Angela McCraw Hester had started to close in. Investigators had spent more than a year collecting fragments of truth, and every new discovery tightened a circle. They had DNA, they had a matching boot print, they had surveillance footage of her vehicle near the scene, and they had motive, the kind of deep, festering resentment that turns ordinary people into murderers. When detectives finally confronted her in Pocatello, Idaho, she didn't resist. She was calm, almost detached as they read her rights and placed her in handcuffs. To them, it felt like a small victory after 16 months of frustration. But they knew the road to conviction would be long. Forensic science could prove she was in Annie's apartment. But to convince a jury, they needed to prove why. They needed to show that this killing wasn't random, that it was the result of deliberate planning and manipulation. Back in Oregon, the case file now filled several binders. Detectives began to revisit every statement, every photograph, every phone record. They noticed a pattern in Matthew Hester's calls leading up to the murder. He and Angela had exchanged a flurry of messages in the days before Annie's death. Messages deleted from their phones, but recovered from service provider records. The timing of those texts corresponded exactly with Annie's schedule and the evening her daughter went to stay with her grandmother. It was proof that someone inside Annie's personal life had been watching her movements carefully. Angela's trial preparation revealed disturbing new evidence. Detectives executed a new search warrant at the Hester residence in Vancouver. In a crawl space beneath the house, they found a plastic storage container containing clothing, a pair of gloves, and a knife sheath, all sealed inside a garbage bag. Traces of Annie's blood were later identified on one of the gloves. Prosecutors believed these were items Angela had attempted to hide after the attack. The discovery strengthened the state's case beyond question. But what intrigued investigators most was Matthew's reaction. During interviews, he appeared nervous, rehearsed, and over-cooperative. He claimed that Angela had been acting strangely in the months before her arrest, that she confessed nothing, and that he wanted justice for Annie just as much as everyone else. But phone records and credit card receipts told a different story. In the weeks after the murder, Matthew purchased cleaning supplies, plastic tubs, and large trash bags from a local hardware store. He also deleted messages between himself and Angela that investigators were later able to retrieve. It was clear that, at the very least, he knew more than he admitted. By the time Angela was formally indicted for second-degree murder, the prosecution had built a strong, evidence-based case. She pleaded not guilty and awaited trial, but privately, she began to break. In recorded jail calls, she hinted at regret and fear, telling one relative that she should have stayed home that night. Every word was monitored, transcribed, and stored as evidence. While Angela awaited trial, detectives turned their attention fully toward Matthew. In 2019, they presented a detailed report to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. It accused Matthew of solicitation to commit murder and hindering prosecution. Prosecutors believed he had helped plan the attack, advised Angela on when to strike, and later helped destroy evidence. The DA agreed there was enough proof to move forward. In July 2019, 3 years after Annie's death, Matthew Hester was indicted. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Many had assumed the story ended with Angela's arrest, but detectives knew better. They had always believed there were two minds behind the murder, one who wielded the knife and one who guided it. As the legal process dragged on, Annie's family sat through every hearing, every delay, every postponement. Her mother described it as a wound that never healed. Each new revelation brought both relief and heartbreak. Relief that the truth was emerging, heartbreak that it had taken so long. The prosecutor's timeline became the backbone of the case. It showed that Matthew, bitter over the custody loss, had begun expressing hatred towards Annie months before her death. He told multiple friends that she had ruined his life and didn't deserve his daughter. When Angela came into his life, she absorbed that anger, turning it into action. Together, they fantasized about a world without Annie in it. And when words were no longer enough, Angela made those fantasies real. The evidence presented in pretrial hearings was overwhelming. Angela's blood in Annie's apartment, her fingerprint on the knife block, the matching boot tread, the surveillance video of her SUV leaving the scene minutes after the 911 call, and the chilling coincidence that Annie's daughter was away from home that exact night, something only Matthew and Angela could have known. When confronted with the forensic results, Angela's attorney advised her to consider a plea deal. In November 2020, she finally broke. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the plea was read aloud. She showed no emotion, no tears, no apology. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. For detectives, it was a hard-earned victory, but they weren't finished. Matthew's trial continued separately. Prosecutors presented phone records, surveillance footage, and statements from acquaintances suggesting that he had pressured Angela to act. He denied everything, portraying himself as a victim of Angela's instability. Yet the digital trail told a different story. In August 2020, facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a long sentence, Matthew pleaded guilty to solicitation to commit murder and hindering prosecution. He was sentenced to just under 5 years in prison. Though his sentence was far lighter than Angela's, the conviction finally acknowledged what Annie's family had always known, that he was not innocent, that without his influence, Annie might still be alive. The courtroom's final moments were somber. Annie's mother read a victim impact statement through tears. She described her daughter as a gentle soul who deserved better from everyone around her. She spoke about Alice, now older, growing up without her mother's voice or smile. And she spoke about forgiveness, not for the killers, but for herself, because living with hate was another kind of prison. Outside the courthouse, detectives who had worked the case for years stood quietly as reporters asked questions. None of them celebrated. They knew justice had been served in law, but not in life. Nothing could reverse the horror of that night. As the media coverage faded, the story of Anastasia Hester became a case study in domestic violence and premeditated revenge. Experts pointed to it as proof of how jealousy can escalate when boundaries and accountability fail. Annie had followed every legal channel available: restraining orders, custody hearings, mediation. Yet none of it stopped what was coming. The system had protected her on paper, but not in reality. In later interviews, detectives admitted that Annie's case haunted them. They remembered the sound of her faint 911 call, the trail of blood across her apartment, the small signs of resistance that told them that she had fought until the end. They also remembered the patience it took to connect every piece of evidence, The tireless nights reviewing surveillance footage frame by frame, the forensic lab work that finally confirmed the DNA match, and the endless hours of interrogation that chipped away at Angela's silence. When asked what stood out most, one investigator said it wasn't the brutality or the evidence. It was the quiet. The fact that no one had heard her screams clearly enough to react. The idea that a woman could fight for her life in the middle of a residential building and still die alone. That silence became the lasting echo of the case, a haunting reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, just beyond the walls we think keep us safe. By the time both trials were concluded, nearly 9 years had passed since Annie's death. Angela remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence with a faint chance at parole in 2045. Matthew completed his prison term in 2023 and was released under strict supervision. Public records show he now lives out of state, barred from any contact with Annie's family. For Annie's loved ones, the legal endings provided no peace, only permanence. Her daughter, raised by grandparents, continues to carry her memory forward, speaking about her mother in schools and advocacy events focused on domestic abuse awareness. Her story has become both a warning and a memorial. The investigation into Annie's murder was one of persistence, proof that science, evidence, and human determination can eventually uncover the truth, even when lies stand in the way. The detectives who closed the case say they still remember every detail: the dimly lit apartment, the smell of cleaning chemicals, the blood on the walls, and the phone on the floor, the one she used to call for help. That call, barely audible and painfully short, became their mission. They couldn't save her, but they made sure her story would be told. And so, when the court finally adjourned for the last time, one truth remained. Justice had arrived slowly, but it arrived completely. The silence that once covered that small apartment was replaced by the sound of a verdict, clear, final, and deserved. Annie's voice may have faded on that June morning, but in the halls of Oregon's courts and in every file marked Annie Hester case, it still speaks, a whisper that says, "Find the truth, no matter how long it takes."
Years have passed since that night in June 2016, yet for those who lived through it, the detectives, the family, the community, the story of Anastasia, Annie Hester, never really ended. Her apartment has long since been cleaned, repainted, and rented again, but the silence that once filled those rooms remains heavy in memory. The evidence boxes now sit deep inside an archive in Portland, labeled and numbered, but every photograph inside them still tells the same story, the story of a woman who fought to live, and a crime born from hate disguised as love. In the aftermath of the trials, the community of Gresham began to see the full picture of what had unfolded behind closed doors. The murder of Annie Hester wasn't just a random act of violence. It was the final chapter of a long pattern of control and resentment. It showed how obsession, when left unchecked, can grow in the quiet corners of ordinary homes until it consumes everything. Angela McCraw Hester is serving her life sentence at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, Oregon's only women's prison. She has made few public statements since her conviction. In her first parole hearing, she will have the chance to speak about what happened, but that day is still decades away. Until then, she remains one of the most infamous figures in Multnomah County's modern criminal history, a woman whose jealousy and blind loyalty destroyed 3 families, including her own. Matthew Hester, released after serving his 5-year sentence for solicitation and hindering prosecution, now lives under restricted parole supervision in another state. Public records show that he is barred from contact with Annie's family and must report any relocation to state authorities. He has never issued an apology, never publicly acknowledged his role beyond what was required in his plea. To those who followed the case, his silence feels like a second betrayal, a reminder that justice can punish the body but not always reach the conscience. In Annie's family, life after the verdict has been a mix of grief and endurance. Her daughter, Alice, is growing up with the memory of a mother she barely knew but hears about often. Raised by her grandmother, she attends memorial events held every June in Annie's honor,
Small gatherings where candles are lit and photographs are displayed beneath the same summer sky that once hung over that quiet Gresham street. The community has not forgotten. Every year, the local police department uses Annie's case as a training example for detectives learning how to handle domestic-related homicides. The lessons are painful, but necessary. They teach that violence often begins in subtle ways: isolation, threats, control, the gradual erosion of independence, long before it turns physical. Detectives now say that Annie's story changed the way they approach custody disputes and domestic conflicts, pushing for earlier intervention and closer cooperation with social services. Her death became a catalyst for prevention, a warning carved in evidence reports and autopsy files. But the scars of the investigation run deep. Some of the officers who first entered Annie's apartment have spoken privately about what they saw that morning. The image never left them. The quiet of that apartment, the blood against the walls, the phone on the floor, the faint sound of her voice replaying in their minds each time they close a case file. For them, justice didn't erase the horror, it simply gave it meaning. Even years later, detectives described the case as one of the most emotionally draining of their careers. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the realization that Annie had done everything right. She had sought legal protection, followed court orders, and trusted the system. And still the danger came for her. Her case became a haunting question for investigators and advocates alike. How do you protect someone from people who believe they're entitled to her life? The answer, they say, lies in awareness, in recognizing the early signs of coercion and obsession. After the trials, domestic violence organizations across Oregon began citing Annie's story in their outreach programs. Her name appears in presentations, pamphlets, and seminars as an example of why intervention matters. Her family approved the use of her story, saying they wanted her death to help others see what she couldn't, that even small threats can grow into something unimaginable. The Untold Trace documentary closes not only on the crime, but on what followed, the long shadow that violence leaves behind. When Angela's sentencing in 2020, reporters stood outside the courthouse asking Annie's mother how she felt. Her answer was simple: relieved, but it will never be over. Those 6 words became the emotional summary of the entire case. The reporters moved on, but Annie's mother never did. She turned her pain into advocacy, speaking at community centers about domestic violence awareness. She told people that her daughter had been brave, that she had done everything the right way, and that sometimes evil still finds a way in. Her speeches end the same way every time, with a message to those living in fear. If something feels wrong, don't wait. Speak. Ask for help. Don't let silence become your only witness. In the years since, the memory of the Hester case has become part of Oregon's collective consciousness, a case studied in law schools, cited in seminars, and referenced by prosecutors when explaining how circumstantial evidence can build an unshakable case. The combination of DNA, surveillance, and behavioral analysis that caught Angela has been called a textbook example of modern forensic persistence. Every drop of blood, every footprint, every timestamp mattered. It showed that even the most carefully planned murders leave behind something, some trace, however small, that refuses to stay buried. Forensic analysts involved in the case have since retired, but they still talk about the night they opened that final lab report and saw Angela's DNA confirmed from the scene. They describe the quiet satisfaction of knowing that science had spoken for the victim when she no longer could. That drop of blood, invisible to the naked eye, became Annie's final message to her killer. You can hide, but I will still be heard. As time moved on, the Hester case was gradually replaced in headlines by newer tragedies, but for those who followed it closely, the story remains a grim reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can collapse. It's a story of control, of manipulation, of misplaced devotion. But it's also a story of resilience, of detectives who refused to give up, of prosecutors who worked for years to see the truth recognized, and of a family
who found a way to live with the unthinkable. Today, the apartment complex where Annie died looks ordinary again. Children play in the courtyard. Residents come and go, unaware of what happened there nearly a decade ago. Only those who know the story notice the subtle stillness that seems to linger near the ground floor windows. The memory of that night doesn't fade. It waits quietly, a ghost made of truth. Annie's legacy now lives in prevention programs and awareness campaigns. Her daughter continues to speak at school events about her mother's kindness, her creativity, and her strength. Each time she does, she reclaims a piece of the voice that was stolen. The story of Anastasia Hester isn't about how she died. It's about what her death revealed. It exposed the quiet cruelty that can grow inside relationships, the dangerous line between anger and obsession, and the failure of love when it becomes possession. It reminded the world that the greatest threats often come from those who once said, "I love you." When the Untold Trace closes this chapter, it leaves behind not fear, but understanding. An understanding that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about remembrance. It's about giving back the truth that the killer tried to erase. In the end, the apartment is quiet again. The case is closed. The files are sealed. But somewhere in the echo of that last 911 call, a voice still whispers through time. It isn't the sound of pain anymore. It's the sound of persistence. It's the proof that no matter how deep the lies are buried, the truth always finds a way to rise. Anastasia Hester, Annie, will never grow old, never see her daughter graduate, never live the life she fought so hard to protect. But her story remains, carried by the detectives who solved it, the prosecutors who argued it, and the people who remember her. Her voice began with a whisper for help. Today, it ends with a message that cannot be silenced, because every trace left behind, every drop, every print, every unanswered call is proof of something greater, that truth survives, that even in death, Annie's story refuses to fade. And that is the untold trace she leaves behind.